I bid you welcome.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
How do you like that, eh?
Even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright.
I love dead, hate living.
It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
If I'm the Phantom, it is because man's hatred has made me so. If I shall be saved, it will be because your love redeems me. Thus does Lon Chaney's Erik pull at our heartstrings. That's the power of the universal monsters, their humanity, their ability to cast a sympathetic spell over us. Our hearts break for them, despite the horror they inflict upon others. At the end of the day, just like us, they simply wish to be loved. This is especially true of the Phantom of the Opera. I mean the Wolfman, and this is the Monster Archives. If you recall from a previous episode, in 1922, Carl Laemmle, the president of Universal Pictures, took a vacation to Paris. During his time there, he met author Gaston Leroux, who was working in the French film industry at the time. Laemmle mentioned his admiration of the Paris Opera House, leading Leroux to give him a copy of his 1910 novel, The Phantom of the Opera. Laemmle read the book in one night and bought the film rights as a potential project for actor Lon Chaney. Following the massive success of The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, it seemed only appropriate to follow up a massive spectacle of a film with another. And while The Phantom of the Opera certainly contains plenty of spectacle, the one major difference in the two films is the added element of horror in Phantom. Many fans still consider Quasimodo a universal monster simply because of his grotesque appearance. But that film is far from a horror movie. This would mark The Phantom of the Opera as Universal's first true horror film. Production was scheduled for late 1924 at Universal Studios. The filmmakers were unfamiliar with the layout of the Paris Opera House and consulted Ben Carré, a French art director who had worked at the opera and was familiar with the novel. Carré said Leroux's depiction of the opera cellars was based more on imagination than the actual layout. The artist created 24 detailed charcoal sketches of the back and below stage areas of the opera house, which the filmmakers then replicated. Carré returned to Europe when shooting began and had nothing else to do with the film. He was shown a print in the 1970s, realizing that his designs had been used. The screenplay was written by Elliot J. Clausen, who had worked as the scenario writer of director Rupert Julian since 1916. Clausen's first script was a close adaptation of the original novel, including scenes that never appeared in the released film, such as the Phantom summoning Christine to her father's grave in Brittany, where he poses in the cemetery as the Angel of Music and plays the Resurrection of Lazarus on his violin at midnight. This scene was even filmed by Julian, but excised after he left the project. But we'll get to that later. Inspired by the novel, Clausen added a lengthy flashback sequence to Persia, where Erik, the Phantom, served as a conjurer and executioner in the court of a depraved sultana, using his Punjab lasso to strangle prisoners. Falling from the sultana's favor, Erik was condemned to be eaten alive by ants. He was rescued by the Persian, the Sultana's chief of police, who became Inspector Ledoux, played by Arthur Edmund Carew, in the film, but not before the ants had consumed most of his face. This offered a definite explanation as to the hideous features of Erik. However, the flashback was eliminated during further story conferences, possibly due to budgetary reasons. Instead, a line of dialogue was added to the script to explain that Erik had been the chief torturer and inquisitor during the Paris Commune, when the opera served as a prison, with no explanation to his damaged face. Universal considered the novel's ending too low-key, but Clausen's third revised script retained the scene of Christine giving the Phantom a compassionate kiss. Erik is profoundly shaken and moans, "Even my own mother would never kiss me." A mob approaches, much like the final cut of the film, led by Simon, the brother of the stagehand who Erik murders earlier. Erik flees the opera house with Christine in a coach, which overturns due to his reckless driving. He escapes the mob by scaling a bridge with the aid of his strangler's lasso, which Simon cuts. The Phantom falls to his death. His final words are, "All I wanted was to have a wife like anybody else, and to take her out on Sundays." Yeah. Understandably, Universal remained dissatisfied. There were other revisions that ultimately didn't make the final cut as well. Production began in mid-October of 1924 and went anything but smoothly. According to director of photography Charles Van Enger, Lon Chaney and the rest of the cast and crew had strained relations with director Rupert Julian. Eventually, the star and director stopped talking to one another altogether. Van Enger served as a communicative go-between. He would report Julian's directions to Chaney, who responded with, "Tell him to go to hell." As Van Enger recalled, Lon did whatever he wanted. There was also a reported incident of Norman Carey actually charging at Julian while riding a horse, knocking him to the ground in front of a group of onlookers. Rupert Julian was then considered the studio's top director, having taken over Erich von Stroheim's problematic 1923 film, Merry-Go-Round. But on the set of Phantom, his skills as a director were questioned by the cast and crew alike. According to Van Enger, Julian had wanted the screen to go black immediately after the chandelier had fallen upon the opera audience. Van Enger ignored Julian and lit the set with a soft glow so the aftermath of the fall would be visible to the audience. The ending was changed yet again during filming. The scripted chase scene through the streets of Paris was discarded in favor of an unscripted and more intimate finale. To save Raoul, Christine agrees to marry Erik, and she kisses him on the forehead. Erik is overcome by Christine's purity, as well as his own ugliness. The mob enters his lair and the catacombs, only to discover the Phantom slumped dead over his organ, where he had been playing his composition, Don Juan Triumphant. By mid-November of 1924, the majority of Chaney's scenes had been filmed. Principal photography was completed just before the end of the year, with 350,000 feet of negative exposed. Editor Gilmore Walker assembled a rough cut of nearly 4 hours. Universal demanded a length of no more than 12 reels. A score for this cut of the film was prepared by Joseph Carl Briel. No information about the score survives other than Universal's release, presented with augmented concert orchestra, playing the score composed by Briel, composer of the music for The Birth of a Nation. The exact quote from the opening day full-page ad in the Call Bulletin, a newspaper that served San Francisco, read, "Universal Weekly claimed a 60-piece orchestra." Moving Picture World also reported that music from the opera Faust would be supplied for the film. The first cut of the film was previewed in Los Angeles on January 7th and 26th, 1925. Audience reaction was extremely negative and summed up by the complaint, "There's too much spook melodrama. Put in some gags to relieve the tension." By March, Universal had decided against the filmed ending. The redemption arc for the Phantom was abandoned. Only a few frames of this ending still survive. The planned New York premiere was canceled, and the film was rushed back into production. A new script was written that focused more on Christine's love life. It is unknown whether director Rupert Julian walked away from this new production or was fired, though the latter is likely. His replacement was Edward Sedgwick, who would go on to direct Buster Keaton's 1928 film, The Cameraman. A decent amount of the film was reshot, with Raymond L. Schrock, an original screenwriter, Elliot Clausen, writing new scenes at the request of Sedgwick. The film's tone was shifted from the dramatic thriller originally presented into more of a romantic comedy with action elements. Most of the new scenes depicted added subplots, with Chester Conklin and Vola Vale as comedic relief to the heroes, and Ward Crane as the Russian Count Ruboff, dueling with Raoul for Christine's affection. Perhaps elements of this were used in the 1943 remake. This version of the film was previewed in San Francisco on April 26, 1925. It was received so badly, the audience booed it off the screen. The third and final version resulted from Universal holdovers, Maurice Pivar and Lois Weber editing the production down to 9 reels. Most of the reshoots completed by Sedgwick were removed, except for the ending, with Erik being hunted by the mob and being thrown into the Seine River. Much of Rupert Julian's cut material was edited back into the picture, though some important scenes and characters were not restored. Ultimately, this third cut was pieced together with scenes from both Julian's and Sedgwick's respective shoots. Like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it debuted on September 6, 1925, at the Astor Theater in New York City. The score for the Astor premiere was to be composed by Professor Gustav Heinrichs. However, the score was not prepared in time, so instead, according to Universal Weekly, the premiere featured a score by Eugene Comte, composed mainly of French airs and the appropriate Faust cues. No expense was spared at the premiere. Universal even had a full organ installed at the Astor for the event. Since the Astor was a legitimate theater, it used an orchestra, not an organ, for its music. Lon Chaney, of course, played Erik, the Phantom. Norman Carey returned alongside Chaney following The Hunchback of Notre Dame as the heroic male lead, Vicomte Raoul de Chagny. Mary Philbin, who had been deemed a Universal super jewel by director Erich von Stroheim, played Christine Daae, her most celebrated role. Arthur Edmund Carew portrayed Ledoux, and Gibson Gowland played Simon Bouquet. The final surviving cast member was Carla Laemmle, Carl's niece, who played the role of a prima ballerina at the age of about 15 years old. Of course, Lon Chaney was once again given the freedom to create his own makeup, a practice that almost became as famous as the films that he starred in. Remember, most actors still had to apply their own makeup, and Chaney was an absolute master by this point in time. Here's a quote from Chaney himself. "In The Phantom of the Opera, people exclaimed at my weird makeup. I achieved the death's head of that role without wearing a mask. It was the use of paints and the right shades and the right places, not the obvious parts of the face, which gave the complete illusion of horror. It's all a matter of combining paints and lights to form the right illusion." Chaney referenced a color illustration from the novel by André Castain as his model for the Phantom's appearance. He raised the contours of his cheekbones by stuffing wadding in his cheeks. He used a skull cap to raise his forehead height several inches and accentuate the bald head of the Phantom's skull. Pencil lines masked the join of the skull cap and exaggerated his brow lines. He then glued his ears to the side of his head and painted his eye sockets black, adding white highlights under his eyes for a skeletal effect. Chaney created the Phantom's skeletal smile by attaching prongs to a set of rotted false teeth and coating his lips with grease paint. To transform his nose, he applied putty to sharpen its angle and inserted 2 loops of wire into his nostrils. Guide wires hidden under the putty pulled his nostrils upward. Black grease paint was then applied inside his nostrils as a final touch. Cinematographer Charles Van Enger claimed that Chaney suffered due to the makeup, especially the wires, which sometimes made him bleed like hell. Van Enger also shared that he was Chaney's unsuspecting guinea pig. Chaney had summoned Van Enger to his dressing room without telling him why. When Van Enger arrived, he stood about a foot behind Chaney, whose face was hidden. Chaney suddenly spun around in his full Phantom makeup. I almost wet my pants. I fell back over a stool and landed flat on my back. Chaney laughed so hard, and Van Enger, who was by then mad as hell, yelled, "Are you nuts?" Unable to clearly talk with his fake teeth in, Chaney spat them out and said, "Never mind, Charlie. You already told me what I wanted to know." To heighten the shock of the Phantom's face reveal, Universal forbade any photos of the unmasked Erik to be published prior to the film's release. Lobby cards showed the Phantom in his hat and garb from behind, and the original release poster was painted, showcasing the Phantom in his Red Death garb. According to Van Enger, Mary Philbin's reaction to the unmasked Phantom was real. She had no idea what Chaney would look like until that exact moment. When audiences first saw the movie, reports of folks screaming and fainting spread due to the unmasking scene. Chaney's appearance as the Phantom is still considered the most accurate depiction of the character based on the description given in the novel. As in the novel, Chaney's Phantom has been deformed since birth, although mention is made of Erik having escaped as a prisoner from Devil's Island. Some believe an explanation of Erik's appearance could be leprosy. As recognizable and famous as Chaney's portrayal of the Phantom is, one equally important aspect to the success of the film is the Opera House and Catacombs, Soundstage 28. Carl Laemmle commissioned the construction of a set of the Paris Opera House. Because it would have to support hundreds of extras, the set became the first to be created with steel girders set in concrete. For this reason, it was not dismantled until 2014. Stage 28 on the Universal lot still contained portions of the Opera House set, and was the world's oldest surviving structure built specifically for a movie, until the time of its demolition. It was used for hundreds of films and television series, including the 1943 remake, Phantom of the Opera, as well as Dracula in 1931, and The Raven in 1935. Initial reception of the film was mixed. Mordaunt Hall of the New York Times gave the film a positive review as a spectacle picture, but felt that the story and acting may have been slightly improved. Time praised the sets, but felt the picture was only pretty good. Variety noted, "The Phantom of the Opera is not a bad film from a technical viewpoint, but revolving around the terrifying of all inmates of the Grand Opera House in Paris by a criminally insane mind behind a hideous face, the combination makes a Welsh rarebit look foolish as a sleep destroyer." Modern reception has been more universally positive. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 90% based on 50 reviews from June 2002 to October 2020, with a weighted average rating of 8.3 out of 10. The site's critical consensus reads, "Decades later, it still retains its ability to scare, and Lon Chaney's performance remains one of the benchmarks of the horror genre." Still, the film proved popular, grossing $2 million on its initial release on a budget of $632,357. By late 1928, following another Universal Super Jewel spectacle, The Man Who Laughs, which was more of a romantic melodrama, similar in tone to The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Universal announced it had secured the rights to a sequel to The Phantom of the Opera from the Leroux estate. The 1928-29 movie season successfully introduced sound pictures, or talkies, and Universal was ready to cash in on a sound thriller picture. Conrad Veidt, who had played the titular Man Who Laughs, Gwynplaine, was briefly tied to the role of the opera ghost. The October 27, 1928 issue of Moving Picture World and Exhibitor's Herald advertised that Universal will make a picture to sequel The Phantom of the Opera. It will be called The Return of the Phantom and will be directed by Paul Linney. Carl Laemmle Jr. is the supervisor, and Conrad Veidt is the logical man for the big role. It was Chaney who had the Phantom role in the other. Universal could not use Lon Chaney in the film as he was under exclusive contract at MGM. In his book, The Making of the Phantom of the Opera, Philip J. Riley claims that Leroux not only saw the completed 1925 film, but even worked on the planned sequel a bit. When the original release of The Phantom of the Opera reached France in 1925, Gaston Leroux was riding high on the worldwide fame that had come to him from the 15-year-old novel. The book sales had assured him a steady income to care for his family. He was ill and would only live another 2 years. When Leroux saw Erik disappear under the waters of the Seine instead of dying in the opera catacombs alone, Leroux's imagination went to work again, and the result was a sequel called The Return of the Phantom. The rights were eventually bought from Leroux's widow in 1929. From Gaston Leroux's files and some speculation to fill in the gaps, the outline was interesting, but could have also been a joke by Leroux that was taken seriously. While Christine and Raoul are on a train taking them away from Paris and the opera to live a quiet life, the Phantom's body washes up on the shores of the Seine. It is found by the Persian, who discovers that it is not Erik. Erik was still alive. The Persian goes back to the Phantom's hideout to discover that all of Erik's clothes, music, and instruments are gone. The Persian begins his search for Erik. It appears that Erik is leaving clues, purposely leading the Persian out of the country. Christine and Raoul are living happily in Madrid, where he is on leave from his post with the military to attend Christine's premiere at the Opera House in Madrid, and finds out that Erik put his cape on one of the unfortunate mob members during the confusion on the steps at the riverbank and escaped underwater using his reed. That was about as far as the Leroux idea went. Riley's book shares a lot of good information, but it appears his sources about this information were not clearly marked. Still, this possibility is more than exciting. Conrad Veidt as the Phantom and a color and sound sequel to The Phantom of the Opera can be added to the amazing list of what-ifs regarding the world of Universal monsters. Universal ultimately scrapped the sequel, instead opting to re-release the 1925 original with a newly synchronized score and sound effects track, as well as a few new dialogue sequences. Directors Ernst Laemmle, one of Carl's nephews, and Frank McCormick reshot little less than half of the picture with sound during August 1929. Some scenes from this version of the film included the graveyard scene and the original Bal Masque scenes that were cut for this release and are now lost. The footage that was reused from the original film was scored with music arranged by Joseph Czerniawski. Mary Philbin and Norman Carey reprised their roles for the sound reshoot, and Edward Martindale, George B. Williams, Philip Smalley, Ray Holderness, and Edward Davis were added to the cast to replace those from the original who were unavailable. Universal was contractually unable to loop Chaney's dialogue, so another character was introduced who acts as a messenger for the Phantom in some scenes. Because Chaney's talkie debut was eagerly anticipated by moviegoers, advertisements emphasized Lon Chaney's portrayal as a silent one. The sound re-release of Phantom was released on December 15, 1929. While a financial success, adding another $1 million for the studio, this version of the film was reportedly given a mixed to negative review. Most audiences were underwhelmed and confused as the Phantom remained silent. It was particularly criticized by Lon Chaney, who was reportedly angered by the decision to proceed without him and give his dialogue to a newly created character to assist the Phantom. This resulted in Chaney's relationship with Universal straining, and reportedly contributed to his hesitancy to sign on to Dracula prior to his death. The sound version is currently considered lost, as Universal's archived reels were reportedly burned in a studio fire in 1948. However, the soundtrack discs survived, leading to fans producing extensive reconstructions since the film fell into the public domain in 1953. According to Harrison's reports, when the film was originally released, it contained 17 minutes of color footage. That footage was retained in the 1929 sound version. Technicolor's records show 497 feet of color footage. Judging from trade journals and reviews, all of the opera scenes of Faust, as well as the Bal Masque scene, were shot and processed to Technicolor, a two-color system. Prismacolor sequences were also shot for the Soldier's Night introduction. Until recently, only the Bal Masque scene survived in color. However, in 2020, color footage of the ballet scene was found by the Dutch archive Film Museum and uploaded to YouTube. In the scene on the rooftop of the opera, the Phantom's cape was colored red using the Handschigel color process. This effect has been replicated by computer colorization in the 1996 restoration by Kevin Brownlow's Photoplay Productions. As with many silent films, black and white footage was tinted various colors to provide a certain mood. Amber was used for interiors, blue for night scenes, green for mysterious moods, red for fire, and yellow as sunshine for daylight exteriors. In 1998, The Phantom of the Opera was added to the United States National Film Registry, having been deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Perhaps more than any other Universal silent film, it remains the catalyst for the studio's focus on horror films at the beginning of the following decade. Lon Chaney was wanted to portray Count Dracula, mostly due to his performance here. Had he survived, the world of Universal Studios' classic monsters may have looked very different. But before we get to the 1930s and the era of talkies, we have a few more films of the silent era to celebrate and focus on. Following the success of The Phantom of the Opera, it was time for a haunted house picture. Join us next episode as we take a deep dive into the 1927 comedy horror film, The Cat and the Canary. This episode of the Monster Archives was written and produced by me, Ian Bates. For more on the Monster Archives, including scheduling updates and news, be sure to follow @Universal Studios Monsters on Instagram. And thank you for listening.